This is Ben Bose from Tech Lockdown. For the last 7 years, I've worked fully remotely, and 90% of my day is spent on the computer, usually alone, without anyone around to keep me accountable. I've always wanted to live a porn-free life, but honestly, I kind of felt like this wasn't attainable since I was around technology all the time that I could use to look at stuff that I shouldn't look at. I realized that I was having to use too much self-control and that this was actually really draining me. So I started by renting a really basic office space for, I think it was about $450 a month, and I put my computer there, and I just felt a huge sense of mental relief because during the workday I wasn't thinking about anything other than work, and then when I'd come home and if I had any kind of urge, I could just use self-control to tell myself no. Then the COVID pandemic hit and I lost access to my office space and I had to move everything back to my apartment. Renting the office showed me that I could go really long periods of time without looking at porn just by reducing how much willpower I was using on a regular basis. So I figured the next best thing was to just set up a porn blocker, which would make it much harder for me to just compulsively look at porn. This was definitely better than nothing, but once I figured out how to either get around the blocking solution or I found things that were unblocked, it was like I wasn't using a blocker at all. I realized that I needed to go a step further and I couldn't just install a porn blocker. I needed to sort of develop my own blocking system so that it was much more thorough and effective and harder to get around. It took me a few months, but I eventually figured out a system that works really well for me and is really similar to me just renting an office and putting all my technology there. I use a mix of DNS filtering with application blocking and then a password management system that makes it really difficult for me to just log in and disable an account. If you've ever added a photo to a social media website and then that platform suggests that you tag specific friends that are actually in that photo, it's able to tell who your friends are because of machine learning. Machine learning is one of the reasons that DNS filtering is actually getting really good at blocking adult content. Not all DNS filters use machine learning. A lot of them are just relying on very large lists of websites that have been curated, and then they block content based on those lists. I use a company that's literally called DNS Filter, and it's one of the best on the market today. The problem with DNS Filter is that it costs $100 a month if you want access to its full capability. The good news is that I was able to figure out how to get access to DNS Filter for only a few dollars a month, and I make this available to Tech Lockdown members. After I set up DNS Filter on my home router, I also configure it directly on my computer. The roaming client is one of the main reasons that I use DNS Filter. It's a way that you can keep your computer connected to DNS Filter even when you're on a different internet connection. One of the biggest benefits of the roaming client is that once you install it, it can block different methods that you might use to get around DNS filtering, and you can also install it in such a way that's really difficult to disable. The next thing I configure is I set up the host file on my computer to block really large lists of websites. You can find pre-curated lists of host file entries that block hundreds of thousands of adult websites, and you can simply copy and paste that into your host file. The next thing I configure is an application blocker, and I use that to password protect different features on my system. So one thing I do is I restrict access to my host file and I make it only accessible through a password. The next thing I set up is URL filtering. This is different from DNS filtering, which can only block an entire website. URL filtering can block specific parts of a website. This is really useful if you want to use a website like YouTube or Reddit, but having full access to that website is causing you to slip up. With a URL filter, you can whitelist specific parts of that website and then block everything else. The final part of my system is that I use a really restrictive password management process so that it's kind of difficult for me to just log into accounts and disable things. If you want step-by-step tutorials on how to implement this system on any device that you have, go to techlockdown.com.